Hello, and welcome to our Monday Supper, where tonight we'll talk about billion-dollar budget deficits, renewed calls for a state income tax, and a sex ed dispute in the superintendent of public instruction race. Our guests tonight are House Minority Leader J.T. Wilcox, Jason Mercier, who's the Government Reform Director for the Washington Policy Center, and Maya Espinoza, candidate for Superintendent of Public Instruction. Representative Wilcox had an interesting career before politics as the fifth-generation leader of his family business, Wilcox Farms. He served as chairman of the National Got Milk campaign and locally on the Nisqually River Basin Land Trust. Hello to JT. Jason Mercier is based in the Tri-Cities. He has served on the boards of the Washington Coalition for Open Government and Verify More, and was an advisor to the 2002 Washington State Tax Structure Committee. Hello, Jason. And Maya Espinoza, who's been on our show before, has a background that sounds a lot like mine. She was raised in a military family, and we both attended Clover Park High School in Lakewood. Currently, Maya is executive director and founder of the Center for Latina Leadership. Welcome back to Maya. And now I'll pass the show to Mike, who's holding on as our family's favorite candidate for Attorney General.
Thank you, Camille. I think the cat is gaining fast on me, though, so you got to watch that cat. Thank you for joining the 12th edition, believe it or not, of our live stream show, Where Has the Time Gone? When we started this program from our basement, the state was just beginning to lock down under orders from Governor Inslee. COVID-19 was an unseen and unknown killer, and I think it's fair to say many of us were fearful about the future. Now, 3 months later, much of our state is starting to reopen. Voters are just starting to understand how huge the challenges are that we have ahead of us. Billions of dollars in state budget deficits, record high unemployment, businesses of all sizes struggling to survive. So we'll talk with our guests about those challenges and also some of the solutions that are being proposed, like a state income tax. We'll also talk about how we got here with the stay-at-home order, what we've learned, and how those lessons can help us if COVID-19 has another outbreak this fall. Before we move to that topic, I wanted to talk with Maya Espinoza, who's been with us before, about her legal battle with the current superintendent of public instruction, who she is running to replace. Maya, are you with us?
I'm here, Mike.
Great, thank you, Maya. Now you're running to replace Chris Reykdal. I'm not sure I said that right, but he's taken the very unusual step of suing your campaign for something you put in the voters pamphlet statement. Can you tell us what you said that he really, really didn't like?
Yeah, he's trying to police what I said. So I did receive a notification of a lawsuit that, basically is threatening to sue me if I don't change a statement, a line in the voter's guide. And that line is: the incumbent ignored parents and educators by championing a policy which teaches sexual positions to fourth graders. And I meant every word.
Well, Maya, he says you are not being truthful by putting in the voter's guide a statement that you just mentioned, that he supported a curriculum that teaches young children about sexual positions. How are you going to back up your statement that it's truthful?
Yeah, it's true that the bill that was passed, 5395, does not outline explicitly, or give these instructions to fourth graders, but the policy itself does. The bill mandates a statewide sex ed curriculum, a comprehensive sex ed curriculum, which is very specific. And there are only a handful of curriculum options that this office, Superintendent Reykdal's office, has approved that as meeting the criteria. And of that small handful, one of the curriculum, which is available on OSPI's website, includes links to a book which shows sexual positions, different sexual positions, among many other things, and it is for fourth graders. So I firmly believe that he did champion a policy which teaches this to our kids, and it's outrageous, and I think the public deserves to know. And I don't think it's fair that he's trying to silence me, but I'm not all that surprised because he ignored parents and teachers by the thousands that said they didn't agree either.
Well, my two sons are now headed off to graduate school, so I won't have to go through what you and other parents will go through.
Yeah.
But it's truly horrifying if that's an option. So I understand that there's an upcoming hearing on Mr. Reichal's claim or lawsuit against you, really. What is he asking the court to do? And when is that hearing?
Yeah, so the hearing's supposed to be this Friday, and of course that's a tight turnaround, so we'll see if that actually happens. But he's petitioning that I remove that sentence or change it to something agreeable. I don't think they'd be happy with the other options that we could put forward. We have other examples we could use, but I don't see a scenario where he's happy with it.
And that hearing is this Friday. Is that what you said?
Supposed to be this Friday. Yep.
Okay. Well, stay tuned, everyone. This is about to get a lot more interesting, I think. The topic is certainly very interesting, but the legal implications are huge with First Amendment rights being first and foremost. I know the K through 12 sex ed bill promoted by the current superintendent of public instruction and passed by the legislature is one of the reasons that you decided to run for that office. Can you tell us a little bit more about the other reasons why you're running?
Thank you for asking that question. Certainly, this is the reason that I jumped in. It was the final straw for me, what caused me to, take this leap of faith. But as an educator and as a parent of kids in public school and as a product of public education, I definitely see a need for serious systemic change in our education system. And I think that's been long overdue. I can talk about kind of my experiences that led me to this point and why I think I'm qualified for this office. But, the bottom line is our educational system, was built for a factory model. It was built to churn out kids that would eventually take jobs in a factory, hold a job of a set hours and set break times and follow, the instructor, the line head or whatever the case was. And in our classroom setting, it's the teacher. And we just have a different economy today, and we're going to have a different economy tomorrow. I really believe that the COVID related school closures and business closures for that matter, showed us that our economy is constantly evolving. And who knew that it was possible to conduct business from home, almost exclusively. We know businesses are moving to that model now. But more importantly, we just don't have the same kind of industrial era economy that our school system was built for. So I believe that it's long time for a change. I think the evidence is there that our kids are not achieving educational attainment that is relevant to them in their careers or even college. We're not even, getting them ready for college if that's where they need to go. Employers spend billions trying to remediate their new employees to get them up to where they need them to be. I just think we can do so much better. And, for better or for worse, this COVID crisis has given us the opportunity to do that. So I envision a whole new education system, and I'm asking anybody that wants to get involved to help me develop that vision.
Well, a terrific vision. Thank you, Maya. I had the pleasure of serving with you on a statewide political board and got to know you and what an outstanding person you are. And you're already an outstanding candidate. And I'm not. I don't predict outcomes of court cases. I do that for a living. I should say I go to court for a living. But I think you're in really good hands with the folks you've hired, and I wish you the best.
Thanks, Mike. I appreciate your input.
All right, let's move on to our next topic. Our state will need experienced leaders to guide us through the tough challenges that we're facing over the next few years. We were facing big challenges before the virus. I'm having some technical issues here. So I'll switch over here. Like homelessness, which will likely get worse if we don't do something. Add to those challenges a pandemic, economic hardship, and the need to address racial injustice. And then there's the threat to the rule of law from those who gave us the chop. breaking news, Mayor Durkan says she's going to announce a plan to remove the CHOP, but we'll see. I'm running for Attorney General to use my decades of legal experience and my decades of experience as a business community and political leader to help our state with these tough challenges. When I think of the qualities of leadership our state needs right now, I think of former elected officials like Governor Dan Evans, Senator Slade Gordon, and Attorney General Rob McKenna. And of our current elected officials who have those same leadership qualities, JT Wilcox is one of those who I think of first. Those of you who know JT probably already agree. Those of you who don't know JT, well, listen in. JT, welcome to our program. I hope you're there.
Hey there.
Yep, there you are. Okay. You were initially supportive of Governor Inslee's stay-at-home order, but after the first several weeks, you became a very pointed critic. Can you explain why your views changed on the stay-at-home order?
Sure, and I wouldn't really even say that my views changed. I think as we think about the state of knowledge that was available in kind of mid-November when the governor called about that, it was very alarming. And I thought that it was important that leaders on all sides take the side of caution and support the governor. That's what you do when there's uncertainty and a threat. But I also think that the best leaders are the ones that do what the governor has said over and over. You look at data and science and you adjust as your state of knowledge changes. And it became clear after a few weeks that we knew a few new things about COVID. First of all, the people that were most at risk was a relatively limited part of the population. And our greatest efforts should go towards protecting them. It also became very plain that it is important to do more than one thing at a time. And the governor has shown over the 7.5 years that he has served in Washington that he really likes to do just one thing at a time. And up till now, that has been carbon. And I thought that he was just single-minded about carbon, but it turns out that he's single-minded regardless of the circumstances. And I don't mean that as a cut. I think that he is a person that likes to have just one priority. And so rather than understanding that in leadership, you have to do multiple priorities, he decided that he was going to do Corona, as we called it then, COVID, as we call it now, to the exclusion of the needs of the economy. And we're going to need a strong economy long after we have vaccines and COVID is defeated. And so I think most people that looked at the science and data and have experience in business and in political leadership urged him strongly to pursue both of those goals at the same time. And I don't always have a quarrel with what he does. I do have a quarrel with his timing in how he pursues those things. And after a lifetime in business, and as you mentioned, a number of generations here in Washington doing that, I know that weeks and months matter. And there are many, many businesses, small, medium, and even a few large ones that will not be able to recover because the extent of these restrictions have gone past what was necessary to keep Washingtonians safe and have gone past what is necessary to allow the survival of many, many important employers here. And that's a tragedy. And to pretend that the only thing that matters is public health when we know that we have to do public health and the economy at the same time, I think was a huge mistake on his part.
Now, we've talked on this program about the emergency law invoked by Governor Inslee and how that law should be amended to limit his powers in the future. But that future is right now, it seems, as the orders have continued for months and there seems to be no end in sight. I know you've talked about this. How do you think the emergency law should be amended for future pandemics or even this one if it continues?
Yeah, well, let me go into some history first. As you probably know, I was a history major, so I almost can't avoid doing that sometimes. And I come from a family that cares about history. These emergency laws were written over the last 4 decades. And I think the original ones that gave him the greatest amount of power actually envisioned the Cold War turning into a hot war with a nuclear attack and sometimes with sort of the Cascade earthquake in the background, where it would be absolutely impossible to have a normally functioning government. It didn't envision a illness where we have lots of workarounds where we could have a fully functioning government. And so I think to apply this over the long term is absolutely corrosive. And one thing that we've learned is that emergency powers are a drug, and it is hard to kick a habit. And I think the fact that he has resisted, opportunities to call the legislature in to regularize some of the things that he's doing has been a huge mistake on his part. And Washingtonians, maybe even yet to be born, may regret that we've gone down this path. And I don't want to live one more day, if possible, under emergency orders, because we can do this using our normal governmental functions. So we have the appropriate members in our caucus, including Jim Walsh, who's our lead on state government, already working on bills that would make it harder to extend emergency orders in the future. Right now, the governor can extend these as long as he wants. The law that applies is as long as the emergency applies. And the only people that can dispute that really are the courts. And so we would like to have the legislature, as long as it's able to function, be the ones that decide whether or not his basic and far-reaching emergency orders can be extended over time.
Of course, I'm running for Attorney General, a position that former Attorney General Slade Gorton reminds me has an independent duty to protect the citizens. I've suggested the emergency law be amended to require, after a certain amount of time that you can debate, that the governor get a sign off from the Attorney General as to whether his order is constitutional. This would be an additional check and balance on his emergency power. I may be asking you this for the first time, but you have any reaction to that idea?
Well, I think the more oversight that we have, the better. And I would not be opposed to that, but I think we're in a situation right now where I don't have a lot of faith that the current occupant of that position is going to apply the same kind of judgment that you, for example, would do. So I think that would be an additional safeguard, but I would like to have as many people as possible involved in having responsibility for extending emergency orders. And it is just not part of being an American to feel like one person should be able to suspend almost any law and to, promulgate orders that require people to do things that they don't want to do. So, Mike, I'd love for you to have that power, but I think the legislature should have that power also.
Yes, and I wasn't suggesting anything to the contrary. I think personally, I think there should be a time limit on his emergency power and mechanisms to allow the governor to extend it beyond that time limit, but requiring the input of the legislature and others. The power is too awesome. And honestly, in my wildest dreams, I never would have imagined these emergency powers being invoked without calling the legislature back into session to present a plan for how we're going to move forward in a pandemic. I never in my wildest dreams would I have imagined that. Well, let me ask you this, JT. We talked about how you ran a business for many years, and you talked a little bit about the impact on business, but I know from some of the things I've read that you have written that you are seeing the devastation among, in particular, small business because of the stay-at-home orders and COVID-19. Can you talk about those a little bit more and what you see as a potential long-term consequence for our state?
Sure. And I'd also like to say, this is, I've attacked the governor for not wanting to do more than, anything besides public health. We want to do not just the economy. We want to do the economy and public health too. So that's absolutely critical. And I know no small businesses or medium-sized businesses for that matter that want to get people sick, especially their staff. So again, this is always about doing both of these things. And I have heard from more people who tell me that they are closing down or on the verge of closing down. And I think that the state is going to be a much less vibrant and attractive place because of that. I've really spent a lot of time around the Seattle business community. And one of the things that makes Seattle so attractive to the tech world, for example, is the fact that they can come here and know that they're in a place where young, technically trained people want to be. And honestly, a lot of them are here to headhunt, employees of some of our other great tech companies. And if we don't have that vibrant social life and that vibrant cultural life, which is almost always made up of, small startups that often are not economically and secure in business terms, I think that we're going to lose that cachet that we have had. And again, when it comes to business, a week or 2 weeks without any revenue can destroy you. I cannot imagine my own business, for example, surviving if we went 2 weeks with no revenue. And now we're starting to talk about 3 and 4 months in many cases. I think the other thing that I want to say is we have a well-established public health system that is based in some cases on counties, and in other cases on associations of multiple counties that have handled public health for many years, and they are more than capable of taking on the job that the governor has usurped in some cases. So if the governor is not able to issue these orders to the extent that he wants, we have a really good system in place that can be customized based on geography and demographics.
We're talking with J.T. Wilcox, House Republican leader. And I'm going to bring our next guest into this conversation here in just a minute. Governor Inslee's stay-at-home order, whether you agree with it or not, has unquestionably damaged our state's economy, as JT has pointed out, also reducing the revenues of state and local governments. To tell us how big the hit will be, let me bring in Jason Mercier, I hope I got that right, who lives in the Tri-Cities and is the Government Reform Director for the Washington Policy Institute. Welcome, Jason.
Good evening, Mike. Thanks for having me on.
Well, thank you for joining us. What is the current projection for the fiscal impact of COVID-19 on our state budget?
Well, 2020 has turned the world upside down, including our state's economic outlook. Just 6 months ago, when the legislative session started, I was before the legislators talking to Representative Wilcox trying to pitch a sales tax cut. We had such strong economic growth. This was the time to finally cut taxes. Now, 6 months later, we are staring at the need for a special session to balance the budget because of, not surprisingly, if you go months without economic activity, if you were under a government-imposed economic shutdown, you're going to see a drop in your revenue collections. And sure enough, on June 17th, when we had our quarterly revenue forecast, that news hit. We are looking at about a $9 billion reduction in expected revenue through 2023. And that's split up about $4.5 billion in this current budget and $4.5 billion in the next budget. I don't want to sugarcoat this. That is a huge problem. It's going to be very hard to address. But a little bit of context on this is not what we experienced in the Great Recession. You think back to what we were going through in 2009, 2010, 2011, we actually saw revenues reduced biennia over biennia, so much so that in that 2009 budget, we spent less than the previous budget. Now, that's a really different thing than you're talking about reducing spending increases. If you're rebasing a budget lower than your prior budget, that's an entirely different situation. So this is a big deal, but even with this drop, we are still expecting to see revenue growth and spending growth. But we've got to act now to make sure this problem doesn't get worse going into the next budget.
And just for context, there is a rainy day fund. Is it enough to cover the $9 billion?
No, and again, you got to think about that $9 billion over a 3-year period. So half of it in this last fiscal year, this next 12 months, and then the rest in the next budget. But the beautiful thing about enacting budget savings is you have a carry forward multiplier. So if you save money now, that makes that next problem that much easier to address. So let's take a look at the current budget. Let's say you've got that $4.5 billion drop. We've got about $3 billion in reserves. There's the possibility of getting some more, not necessarily, you're not going to get the HEROES Act. I know the governor and some in the legislature are waiting to see if Congress passes the HEROES Act that came out of the House. That's not going to happen. You're not going to get $10 billion more from the federal government. What you might be able to get, though, is if you think back to that original action Congress took to the pandemic, the CARES Act, that gave the state and local governments about $3 billion in the state of Washington, with significant strings attached to it. It almost required you to spend new things to be able to access that money. So what we'd like to see happen is get our elected officials, our Congress representatives, give us flexibility for that initial money they gave us. No more money from Congress, just the flexibility. So you take that $3 billion reserve, say you get $1 billion out of that. Now you're still looking at a $1 billion problem. Well, I got news for you. This current budget, we just passed almost $1 billion supplemental increase of new spending. So look at some of that new spending, like the pay raises and the new programs, and now you've got your budget situation almost in hand.
Who is it that said $1 billion here, $1 billion there, and pretty soon you have some real money? Let me ask you this, Jason. Has Governor Inslee taken any steps already to begin to address the looming deficit?
Yeah, so again, I mentioned there was a supplemental budget that was adopted earlier this year that almost increased spending over $1 billion. Once it became very clear that there was going to be some type of economic consequence to this pandemic, he did veto almost $400 million out of that budget over a 4-year period. But still new spending was put into place. He did also, about a month ago, order his agencies to freeze hiring and travel and new contracts, and had them go through a budget cutting exercise. You may have heard about these supposed 15% cuts in spending that would have to take effect if we didn't raise taxes. But, and Representative Wilcox can correct me if I'm wrong on this, I haven't heard anybody say that they want all of this addressed through cuts. You're going to use the reserves, you're going to do some reductions in spending and maybe get some federal flexibility. So those 15% cuts that we've heard about, nobody's advocating for those. Most recently, there's been a call for him to cancel the pay raises that are going to take effect on July 1st. Because something that the governor gets to do is negotiate behind closed doors with the state employees unions for their contracts. The legislature's been removed from that decision. This has only been in place since 2002. Prior to that, the legislature wrote the budget, had control over everything. But a reform for collective bargaining was passed in 2002. The governor now does that behind closed doors on his own. And in this last budget, he agreed to a 3% pay raise in the last year and a 3% pay raise that takes effect July 1st. So there have been calls for him to do like Governor Gregoire did, to reopen those talks, to freeze those pay increases. He hasn't done that, but he did just announce that he struck a deal with the unions to do furloughs that he says will save the same amount of money as a pay freeze. The challenge with that, though, is that's a one-time savings, and you don't get those ongoing savings that you would over the 4-year period.
All right, let me bring JT back into the conversation. JT, you've called for a special session of the legislature to address these and other COVID-19 related issues. It's been more than 3 months since the emergency was declared. Why hasn't the legislature convened?
Well, there's 2 ways of convening the legislature, and the one that has happened throughout the history of Washington has been the governor calls. There's also a mechanism that is not very well spelled out that says that if 2/3 of the legislators call for a special session, it will be convened. I don't think that that's ever happened. House and Senate Republicans called on Democrats to join us to ask for that. And I know of at least one and maybe more Democrats that did join us, but we didn't hit 2/3. So I think there's several things happening. First of all, now that we have a new revenue forecast, we have one of the major data points that could be used in rebudgeting. But there are a couple of unknowns. I think one of the unknowns is how much bailout help are we going to get from the Congress? And I would imagine that there are many Democrats that would like to bet on the election and think that you will get a big bailout after November, depending on how the election goes. And so, state politicians won't have to do the hard things that are necessary to deal with our budget. I think that's one reason for delay. I think another reason for delay is that the governor doesn't really have a history of accomplishing much in a legislative session. He has a 7-year history of coming in with an ambitious program and passing almost none of it. And so I don't think the governor, even though he's a former congressman himself and state legislator, I don't think he feels very comfortable with the legislature. He is not a good communicator. And I think he would just rather continue the current status quo, which is he gets to call just about all the shots. And then I think the other thing is there has got to be some concern on his part and on the part of Democratic leadership in terms of, is this a controllable special session? The history of special sessions is everybody stays home except for the budget negotiators, and they strike a deal, and then we come back in and ratify it. And I've always been a budget negotiator, so I always knew what was happening, but it was pretty controlled. The one exception was the Boeing special session, which again was extremely well controlled. There was a couple of bills that had to be passed, and there was no doubt. If I'm the governor or if I am part of Democratic leadership, I am really concerned about whether things can get out of control. Republicans and Democrats don't really believe that we should be ruled by edicts from the governor. So maybe there is the opportunity for a sort of runaway legislature in that sense. And I am quite sure that there is a powerful part of both Democratic caucuses that want to implement a strongly progressive agenda that will not be really good for swing district Democrats during an election year. And so I think the governor and legislative Democratic leadership are concerned about what the implications of that might be. Now, I think in the end, there is going to be something in August. I think that there is a tentative agreement from the majority on that. But I've also seen the governor throw some cold water on that idea. And we are at this point almost a one-party state, right? We have not super majorities of Democrats, but functional control by Democrats. And so it's totally up to them to decide. But a part of deciding is understanding if you actually can control your caucus. And I would imagine that on the part of the governor, the bad history that he has, even with democratically controlled legislatures, and uncertainty on the part of Democratic leadership means that they're going to be very cautious.
JT, I've heard that some Democrats view this crisis as their chance to finally enact an income tax, which they've been trying to do for decades. Is that something that is being discussed?
Yes. I have been on a number of joint appearances with Democratic leaders, and without exception, they have said that revenue options are on the table. And some, I think, have explicitly said that, some form of income tax, I don't distinguish. If it's an income tax, it's an income tax, will be on the table, as well as other sources of revenue. And I would also point out that, one of their major revenue efforts from a year ago was tossed out in court. The large bank tax, which we all knew, including a number of them, was unconstitutional, was finally struck down. And so they've already got a big hole because those revenues are not going to be coming in.
Well, let me bring Jason Mercier back in on this from the Washington Policy Center. Jason, you've written about how an income tax and a capital gains tax are not the cure-alls that some think, and that states with them have an even bigger budget challenge than Washington State. Can you explain your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so we discussed the $9 billion shortfall coming, the challenge lawmakers are going to have balancing the budget. But even with this is not a situation that's come out of the Washington budget process. This is something that's come out of the governor's economic order shutting down businesses. And I say that because Washington's overall budget framework is pretty sound. You've got a 4-year balanced budget requirement, so you can't have always spending. We've got our constitutional reserves. And when you look at Washington's tax structure, primarily driven by the property, the B&O, and the sales, those are relatively stable revenue sources, which means we're not on a budget roller coaster like you see in California, in New York, where even outside of a recession, their budget's constantly going up and down, and they're constantly having to adjust tax policy. We have usually a nice steady increase in our revenues, which allows the budget to grow in a predictable way. And this is something that we have actually been rewarded on. Our bond rating was just recently increased because the credit companies look at us and say, you guys got a good budget framework and you have really stable tax structure. The flip side of that coin is you look at Oregon and you look at California in particular, and California school district just this past week had their bond ratings downgraded because they rely on income and capital gains taxes, that those revenues just drop off in a down economy. And you saw California's Democratic governor basically come out and just say, when he did his budget proposal last month, the capital gains taxes, the income taxes, they're too volatile. We have a huge hole in our budget, and we've got to cut spending. Now, coming back to Washington, if you've already got a relatively stable budget process and you're already in a recession, why would you try to double down on a volatile revenue source that is killing our neighbors in Oregon and California? It doesn't make sense from a policy standpoint. So we know that they can't get the votes to amend the Constitution to do a graduated income tax. The voters have already rejected that 10 times. This is where this game on the capital gains proposal comes in. They call it an excise tax, saying it's not an income tax, it's an excise tax. That's why we don't have to amend the Constitution, and we can pass it in Olympia with a simple majority vote. The problem with that is there's nobody in the world that calls a capital gains tax an excise tax. Whether it's every state in the country, the IRS, or other countries in the world, they're all in agreement. Capital gains or income, it's an income tax. So, Mike, you may ask yourself, why are they even playing this game? Well, thanks to public records, we finally had everything we've been saying for the past 10 years confirmed from a email exchange from Senator Peterson, who is one of the advocates of this proposal. Basically said to him, the biggest benefit of passing a capital gains tax is not the policy. It's because they'll be sued. It'll go to the state Supreme Court, and they'll see if they can get 5 justices to overturn our 100-year of case law saying you own your income, and then you don't need a constitutional amendment for an income tax anymore.
Well, 4 justices voted to release, 1,000 prisoners or more. Fortunately, they needed 5 votes. So interesting times in the Supreme Court. Well, for both of you, as we close out this topic, what impact do you think more taxes would have if they were imposed right now on the ability of businesses, in particular small businesses, to survive and then to begin rehiring employees that are currently unemployed? JT, let's start with you.
Well, it doesn't take a economics degree to understand that the more you take out of the private sector, the less employment that you're going to see. And this is a time when we have to nurture the private sector. They've been crushed in ways that were totally unexpected, in ways that they couldn't prepare for, and in ways that were essentially imposed by the government. And the last thing that we need to do is impose more obstacles, especially on top of the additional tax burden that was added about 18 months ago. You know, Washington State experienced one of the most prolific tax sessions that anyone has ever seen in 2019. And I hear from every sector, and you know, this time of year, I hear from every sector too, including many that are seen to be as absolutely critical parts of our economy and our social safety net, like healthcare, like childcare, like elder care, like every kind of human service that you can imagine, that they never imagined that they would be the targets of Democrats who are in the majority, believe that they're going to be in the majority for almost forever, and simply want more money to fund their programs at a time when the economy was already providing record high revenues as well as record high increases in revenues. And so we are, I think, at a tipping point now, and we're already seeing companies moving, in some cases, from Seattle to other parts of Washington, in other cases to other states, that understand that a business climate actually matters. You can't do everything because you have Puget Sound and the Cascades here and a great quality of life. You also have to have some understanding of what a business climate means to the economy. And I just hope that people will see reason here. And I would go back to what Jason said earlier. We had a much tougher budget problem back in 2010 and 2011. We can solve the first year problem mainly by reliance on the rainy day fund. That's what it's there for. And about $1.5 billion worth of cut. In the private sector, you deal with reductions in revenue by decreasing your cost of doing business. Washington State can do exactly the same things. We've done it, and we've done it in much more draconian ways 10 years ago than are required right now.
Jason, anything to add to what JT just outlined there?
Well, as the representative mentioned, last year was just an impressive onslaught of tax increases. And you already mentioned how the bank tax.
Impressives, Jason.
It was impressive just how much they passed. You had the bank tax ruled unconstitutional, but they also passed a B&O surcharge to fund higher ed. But they wrote that bill so poorly, the Department of Revenue told them, we can't administer this tax unless we first audit a business to see if they owe the tax, and then we'll send them the bill. So the very first bill that the legislature passed this year, and the very first bill the governor signed into law, was reimposing that B&O surcharge in a way that can actually be administered. So they've already raised taxes this year, even before the recession hit and the economic slowdown. And then I'm here in the Tri-Cities, which means I'm in Benton County, which still is in lockdown. We're still in phase 1. Our businesses are still closed. And every day we are getting notice of another employer who is never going to open their doors again. They're just permanently closing. And if you add taxes on top of that, you're just going to have a lot more small businesses never open their doors.
In my Attorney General campaign, I'm talking about the need for our state to take an all hands on deck approach to helping small business. Fed Chair Jerome Powell has rung the alarm bell that if we don't do enough to keep small businesses going, we will do permanent damage to our economy. Those are his words. For my part, I'll convene a task force like Rob McKenna did during the Great Recession to seek to lift the regulatory burdens on small and medium-sized business, and we'll try to get creative beyond that. Okay, well, we've covered a lot of ground, and there are lots of other issues that we could be talking about. Just as we close out here, Jason, we'll start with you, and then JT. Anything else that you want to flag for our viewers before we move on to our final topic? Jason, start with you.
Hit the emergency orders and the reforms to that. But I think, again, mentioning being here in Benton County, still being in phase 1, and just seeing the arbitrary nature of the health advice coming out. Protests are okay, but we can't open our businesses up. Box stores are okay, but the small mom and pop shop is unsafe. Trying to move away from this essential business to what can be done safe. Everything is essential. Every job is essential. So if one activity can be done safely, give us the advice and trust in us as citizens to conduct ourselves that way in all activities. We just got to get out of this arbitrary decision-making of what can and can't be done in economic activity and in our daily lives.
JT, any last words on stay at home or budget issues?
Yeah, I do. And Mike, this is so appropriate because you're running for Attorney General. Nobody is more important in terms of safeguarding freedom, the Constitution, than the Attorney General. And, you know, I came to Olympia because I wanted to write budgets. I had no clue that I would get involved in the partisan parts of this job or ever be a caucus leader. I just wanted to help write budgets. And so, you know, most of my time has been in the things that we've talked about here with Jason, just the nuts and bolts of revenue, expense, how do you prioritize? But we have so many much bigger issues happening right now. And I just cannot stress enough how corrosive I think it is to freedom and the expectations of generations to come that we get back to a government that functions normally. I don't really question the governor's motives. I think he's a very partisan politician, but I think he is trying to do a good job at the same time. But the unintended consequences of ruling, one person ruling in such a broad way is so un-American. And it, you know, has been almost 250 years since we have seen this. And I don't throw around these labels. I've been called a tyrant a few times too. So I'm not going to talk about the governor in those terms, but we need to think in deep philosophical ways about how we mitigate the damage of this period of history and go forward in a way that rebuilds trust in government, trust in our institutions. And, you know, when we think about Seattle, somebody figure out how are all of us going to stand up for the good things that we have built over 250 years in this country and over around 130 years in this state, and start defending them instead of folding immediately when things get tough. So Mike, we need you, and we need a person who's going to be Attorney General that is not a full-time politician. We need a full-time American and a full-time Washingtonian in that job more than any other position in the state of Washington.
Well, thank you, JT. I'm working as hard as I can to be your next Attorney General, and I think I'm going to be it. But you know, let's transition to the last topic. I saw a Facebook post, JT, from you today, which prompted me to want to talk about this a little bit. We've talked about the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, now called CHOP, on our last week's show. It's getting national and international attention, but not the kind the city wants, with the police driven out of their headquarters and a 6-block area that's now lawless. I've said this is merely an exclamation point on a story we've been seeing for some time. The rule of law is being challenged by forces on the far left fringe of our politics, but they are enabled by those who want to eliminate more moderate voices from government. In the week since our last show, there have been 3 shootings in the CHOP. A man has been killed, and protesters prevented the police from entering to try to provide aid. You've written, JT, about the CHOP. What's your take on how this was allowed to happen and what it means for the future of our state?
Well, first of all, you know, if you expect hot takes, don't go look at my Facebook page. I really like to be able to process things for a while and let them develop and understand, you know, what the best reaction is before I comment. And this morning, I pretty much knew what I wanted to say. And I think, you know, we've got some short-term consequences that are devastating for at least 2 families, right? The person that was killed and the person that did the shooting. You know that there's going to be 2 families that are going to be devastated, and maybe more, because there's always surrounding tragedies to that kind of thing. There are other victims involved, but then there's the long-term implications. And we, you know, saw an attempt in Portland to replicate this. I recently saw on Twitter, a guilty pleasure, that there is talk about an autonomous zone in Washington, D.C., which I think could have even greater impacts. And then, you know, you have the part that is just incomprehensible to me. You have the Democratic Party, which has controlled Seattle for many, many years, controlled the state of Washington in almost exclusive fashion for more than a generation. All of the institutions of Washington have been created based on the desires of Democrats. And, there are qualities that we have in our institutions and there are flaws. And, as a Republican, I'm going to point out the flaws. But for crying out loud, the people that have created these institutions that are necessary, like the police, like our, business structure around Washington, like our cultural assets, where we are uniquely favored in the Northwest to have the benefactors and the facilities that we have. And for them to allow those to be destroyed almost overnight is like cultural suicide. And I do not understand how they can create these things and then fail to defend them. This is a terrible symptom of a problem that we have in our state and among our leadership. And we need to rebuild our confidence. And this is not just a Democratic problem. We need to figure out how Republicans and Democrats can unite around the qualities that we have and defend those, rather than letting them be swept away almost overnight.
A lot of the citizens of Seattle that I talk to feel trapped in a political system that no longer serves them. And I'm sure there are many outside of Seattle. Of course, I work in Seattle and live in Issaquah. But what would you say to people that feel like the current alignment of political forces is not serving them, and with the CHOP being kind of the prime example?
Well, I think you get what you vote for. And, Democrats have incessantly complained about parts of the Republican coalition. And when they have been right, I have stood up. I may be the only caucus leader in the state of Washington, in the United States, that have stood up to the parts of the Republican coalition that may be destructive to the United States. Democrats need to have the same determination. They can't allow people to simply proceed because they are on their side in some ways. And I think that this, the events of the last few weeks have really exposed a set of leaders that are afraid to really stand up when the extremists that are otherwise on their side have decided that they're done with compromise. Compromise is a part of our American system, and you cannot include in your coalition people that are unwilling to listen to the opinions and conform to what the majority needs.
So my translation is, we want J.T. Wilcox to be the Speaker of the State House. And the way to do that, if you're watching and listening, is to find a legislative candidate you can support with an R next to their name and support them. And let's use all this bad stuff that's happening this year as inspiration and motivation to make changes. Thank you, House Minority Leader, House Republican Leader J.T. Wilcox and Jason Mercier for joining us. And thanks to Maya Espinoza as well. And thank you for watching our show. If you want to learn more about my campaign for Attorney General, please go to my website, mikevasca.com, and join our team to protect the Evergreen State. Good night, everyone. Thank you.